The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 1, The Fall. Chapter 0. Tal stretched out his hand and pulled himself up onto the next outthrust spike of the tower. He stopped there to get his breath, and looked down the red tower, down to the twinkling lights that outlined the main buildings of the castle. They were far below, a height that made Tal dizzy. He quickly looked back up. The wind was much stronger than Tal had expected. It howled around the red tower, and then spun through the other 6 towers before coming back at him, even stronger than before. It was also getting colder, making the climb even more difficult. Tal's sunstone kept the worst of the chill at bay. It had taken Tal 2 hours to climb to his current resting place, a hard climb, up through the spikes, gargoyles, and incrustations that covered the tower. Now he was only 4 stretches below the point where the tower appeared to suddenly end, meeting the lid of total blackness that lay across the sky. This was the veil, the strange barrier that kept the whole world in darkness, turning back the light of the sun. Not that it was completely dark around Tal. Like most of the castle, the red tower was lit with small sunstones fixed into the walls and ceilings. The light from those sunstones spilled out the windows so Tal could see where to climb. The other 6 towers blazed with light too, brilliant shafts crisscrossing the sky. The light made many shadows flicker outside. Every gargoyle and decorative flange cast a shadow, dark against the ochre red of the tower. There was Tal's own shadow, too. Like all the chosen of the castle, Tal's shadow did not echo the shape of his body. The shadow that moved with him flowed and changed. Sometimes it had the general shape of a 13-year-old boy. Sometimes it looked like a cat, or a 2-headed Corvile, or something so fluid it was indescribable. For Tal's shadow was not the one he had been born with. It was a shadow guard, a magical being from the spirit realm of Einir. It had been bound to Tal when he was born, replacing his natural shadow, and was commanded to guard and help him. This was just as well, Tal thought. It was bad enough seeing his gangly limbs and scraggly hair in the mirror. He was relieved not to have a shadow of them following him around. The shadow guard didn't show that Tal was shorter than most of the other boys his age, or his slightly crooked smile that he thought made him look a bit slow. No one else did, but it mattered to Tal. He'd practiced smiling in the mirror for hours, trying to straighten that curl on the left-hand side. He didn't mind that the shadow guard was only one of the weakest spirits of Einir, a child's servant. When Tal turned 13 3/4 in 2 months' time, he would enter Einir himself and bind a real spirit shadow to serve him. If he was able to enter Einir. Tal clutched the small sunstone on the silver chain around his neck, feeling its warmth enter his chilled hands. To enter Einir, he needed a primary sunstone, not just for himself, but also for his mother and for his younger brother and sister. Since his mother was very sick, and his father and their family's sunstone had disappeared mysteriously, it had suddenly become Tal's responsibility to look after the family. He wasn't prepared for this, but he didn't have a choice. He had to push his fear deep inside himself and keep it there. He had to be strong, even if he didn't know where to find that strength. He wanted his father back. He wanted his mother well, but both would be lost to him forever if he failed now. In order to save his family, he had to get a new sunstone. A powerful one, not the child's stone he wore at his throat. Tal drew a deep breath and slipped the stone back under his shirt. He had to climb farther, past the veil, out into the full sunlight. He'd seen sunlight before, of course. He'd seen it many times in Einir, the spirit world. But it was softer there, less bright. Tal had only seen the true sun once. When he was 10, his class was taken up beyond the veil and shown the sunstones growing in silver nets that hung from the towers. It had been overcast, but even then all the children had needed their shadow guards to cloak their eyes. Sunstones might capture the light of a sun, but even the most powerful could not compare to its strength and brilliance. Back then, they had climbed up the stairs inside the orange tower. Tal had never thought that one day he would be climbing the outside of one of the towers. To steal a sunstone. To steal a sunstone, he repeated to himself. It was the last resort, the only thing he could think of that would save him and his family. He tried everything else. It was also the riskiest thing he could imagine. It was a hard climb just to get to where he was, but that was nothing. On the other side of the veil there would be guards and traps, powerful spirit shadows that could chew up his shadow guard in a second and capture Tal. There could even be other chosen, members of the Red Order who would be only too pleased to catch a boy of the rival Orange Order. It would be the Hall of Nightmares for him then, or worse, and disaster for the family. Tal shook his head and started to climb again. He reached a gargoyle just below the veil, and almost against his will crouched down to delay reaching the darkness that brooded above his head. It was almost like being underwater and looking up, thought Tal, except into darkness rather than light. Finally, he stretched his hand up into the veil and shivered as it disappeared. But he could still feel it. It was still there. Tal stood up. Instantly, he was caught in total darkness. He started to breathe hard, his lungs seeming to shrivel. He couldn't get enough air. The darkness was sucking the air out of him. He ducked back into the comfortable twilight and the bright beams from the towers, his hand clutched around his now blazing sunstone. Tal quickly focused upon it, and the light dimmed. He didn't want to attract attention. Only a moment after his sunstone dimmed, a faint cry echoed up from below. For a second, Tal thought he'd been discovered, and he shrank back against the tower wall. Then he realized that it hadn't been the shout of a guard, or the high-pitched, inhuman scream of a spirit shadow. It sounded more like a cry for help. It came again, and Tal felt his stomach go hollow and strange. He knew that voice. Quickly, he looked down. There, a good 200 stretches below, was the flicker of a white shirt touched with orange. It was the same sort of shirt that Tal wore, a child's uniform of white, the collar and cuffs bearing the color of his order. Someone had followed him. It had to be his younger brother, Graf, a 9-year-old desperado who tried to do everything his older brother did. Tal recognized the voice and the small, feeble sunstone. "If you touch me, Tal will blast you into bits! Get away! Get—" Graf's voice was suddenly cut off. For an instant, Tal thought his brother had fallen, and his own heart seemed to stop. But Graf hadn't fallen. He had been picked up by a huge spirit shadow, one with the flickering shape of a borzog, a creature long extinct in the flesh. It was easily 4 stretches tall and enormously broad shoulders. Its arms trailed below its knees, and the 2 tusks in its lower jaw were the size of Tal's hands. In the light from the tower it rippled in shades of darkness, a thing of soft edges and blurred lines. It had Graf under one arm, and had pulled Graf's shadow guard over his face like a gag. There was no sign of the chosen the spirit shadow was bound to. But whoever it served, it was taking Graf back down to the tower, probably to the balcony far below where Tal had started his climb. Tal hesitated. He wanted to rescue Graf, but he knew he'd just get caught as well. That wouldn't help either of them, or the family. As before, his only chance lay upward, with the sunstones. Tal faced the veil once more. He'd made a mistake going into it slowly before. This time the thing to do was to reach up, get a handhold, and climb through as quickly as possible. He took several deep breaths and stood up fast, with his hands outstretched above his head. His knuckles grazed stone, and then he felt something he could hold on to. A moment later, his head entered the veil. Once again there was total darkness. But now Tal was prepared for it. He pulled himself up onto the next gargoyle and thrust his hand up for another handhold. He found one, climbed again, and then repeated the process. He still hadn't come out of the veil, and his breath was going. Hesitantly, he took a small breath. It worked, but his fear of not being able to breathe was soon replaced by another terror. What if he was lost in the veil? Maybe it was impossible to climb through it, except inside one of the towers. Maybe he was trapped inside the veil forever. He climbed faster, not caring that his hands were scratched and his knees bruised. Several times he almost fell, but even that didn't scare him as much as staying inside the veil. He had to get out. Suddenly, he broke out into the exact opposite of darkness. Tal screamed as the searing light of the sun hit his eyes. Again, he almost fell, but his shadow garb was already weaving itself across his head, shading his eyes with its strange substance that could be as light as air, as flowing as water, or as solid as human flesh. Tal hung on, half in the veil, half out, as the burning slowly disappeared from his eyes. He could feel his shadow guard on his forehead, and the unfamiliar heat of the sun on his cheeks. Slowly, Tal opened his eyes and looked around. There was a patch of blue sky directly above him, strange and unfriendly compared to the soft darkness of the sky under the veil. Around this patch of blue there were puffy gray clouds, some already drifting down through the veil, bringing a promise of snow. Right in the center of the blue was the sun, so bright he could not look directly at it. It felt dangerous, giving off so much light and heat that Tal felt as if he might suddenly burst into flame. The red tower, like all the others, continued to soar up into the sky. But now, instead of gargoyles and spikes and carvings, the tower walls were covered in long, protruding bronze rods as thick around as Tal's middle. Most of the rods had nets of silver mesh hanging from them, and in those nets there were sunstones. Tal knew that sunstones grew from small jewels brought back from Einar, the spirit realm, but he had not yet been taught how they were prepared. Tal didn't want to know either. Not now. All he wanted to do was climb up farther, because the most powerful stones would be higher up. Slowly, he eased himself out of the veil and crouched on the stone ledge, staying as close to the wall as possible. He couldn't see any spirit shadows or other chosen. There was a half-balcony farther up, though, and someone could easily be standing there, or on the walkway that went right around the top of the tower, 100 stretches above him. Shadow guard, weave me a cloak as red as the tower," Tal whispered. At the same time, he concentrated on his sunstone so it shone with the same red color as the tower walls. He felt the shadow guard moving, and saw a long, thin finger of darkness stretch across and touch the stone. Instantly, the color of the stone bled into the shadow until it was red as well. Then Tal felt the shadow guard spreading itself across his back and down to his ankles. In a few seconds, Tal was covered in a hooded cloak, exactly the same red as the tower walls. As long as he climbed up slowly and didn't make too much noise, he would be almost invisible. Carefully, he started to climb. The bronze rods were slippery, not as easy to grasp as the stone outcrops below, but they were closer together. Tal could use them like steps, moving around the tower as he climbed. He was almost at the balcony when he looked up and saw a hideous head staring over the railing, directly at him. It was a spirit shadow head, grotesque and scary, with multiple eyes and a mouth that stretched the full width of its face, lined with multiple rows of small but very sharp teeth. It was one of the largest spirit shadows Tal had ever seen. This meant it was one of the most powerful. Far too powerful to be in the service of one of the Red, for they were the weakest of the orders. Tal froze, hoping it hadn't seen him. He stayed frozen for what seemed like minutes. Clouds crossed the sun overhead, and suddenly it was much darker, making the spirit shadow harder to see. Tal kept absolutely still, hardly breathing. His heart sounded loud, so loud he was sure the spirit shadow could hear it. Then it started to snow. Snowflakes began to drift down, only to be caught by the wind around the towers and whipped sideways in sudden flurries. Tal knew what snow was. He'd seen it many times through the triple-glazed windows of the outer walk, but he'd never been outside of the castle before. He'd never felt snow. A snowflake landed on Tal's nose, cold, and then suddenly wet. He sneezed. The spirit shadow up above hissed and leaned over the rail. Tal held his breath, but it was too late. It had seen him. It leaned over still farther, revealing a body like a snake's, all long, smooth, and twisting. For a second, Tal thought it was going to fall over, but the spirit shadow slowly uncoiled down toward him. Its eyes, black points darker than the rest of its shadow flesh, were firmly fixed on him. Tal fought the feeling that it would capture him, and he would be taken before the Luminor of the Red, and then to the Hall of Nightmares. He would never gain a primary sunstone, and would all too soon be cast down to join the ranks of the underfolk. From there, he would be unable to help his mother, or Graf, or Kusi. The spirit shadow didn't try to grab him, though. It suddenly shot forward, and its toothy maw opened large enough to take Tal's head off in a single bite. Tal's shadow guard pushed him over as the spirit shadow struck. Despite his shock, Tal instinctively grabbed a rod and locked his legs around it. Upside down, Tal stared up as the creature pulled itself back for another strike. His own shadow guard was letting out a shrill whistle, its warning sign, as it turned itself into a boy-sized shadow and pushed Tal away. Tal pulled himself out along the bronze rod toward the sunstone nets. He couldn't believe what was happening. Spirit shadows couldn't hurt one of the chosen. The spirit shadow laughed, a horrible, high-pitched cackle that cut through Tal's shock and made him swing himself upright and move farther along the rod. Then the spirit shadow spoke, scaring Tal even more. Spirit shadows could speak, unlike the shadow guards, but they never did so in public. They only spoke to their masters, in private. "Seek not the treasures of the sun," said the spirit shadow, its voice like fingernails dragged down stone. "I am the keeper, and none may pass here, save those who know the words." "Words?" muttered Tal as he frantically tried to get farther away. He didn't know any words, not ones that might work here. He'd never heard of the keeper. Surely its master would look over the balcony soon and stop it. The spirit shadow coiled itself completely around the other end of the bronze rod that Tal was sliding on. Tal's shadow guard balanced behind him, in the shape of a four-legged creature with claws and lots of teeth. It would try to guard him, but Tal knew it was too small and weak to slow the spirit shadow for more than a few seconds. Tal looked back at it and felt the panic rise in him again. The snake's spirit shadow shrieked and slowly wound itself forward another stretch. It seemed in no hurry to get to Tal, though its mouth was working backward and forward, almost as if it were chewing. "Help!" screamed Tal, his open mouth collecting a few snowflakes. He didn't care who came now, or how long he might be sentenced to spend in the Hall of Nightmares, or if he would be instantly demoted to the Underfolk. Anything would be better than facing the creature that was inching toward him. "Help!" "The towers are silent, save for thee and me," said the spirit shadow. It arched its long body forward in a sudden movement that sent Tal leaping forward into one of the nets. Frantically, he tried to stand up, but all he could do was roll around. One of his feet broke through the mesh and caught fast, sending a small shower of sunstones falling through the hole. Tal bent forward and tried to free his foot, ignoring the sunstones that were everywhere around him. He'd just gotten it free when the spirit shadow struck. Tal flinched and gasped, but he was not the target. His shadow guard squealed as the thing's mouth closed on it. Instantly, it lost its cat shape and began to change shape so quickly that Tal couldn't keep track. It was a Morlix, a boy, a toppet, a bird-headed monster, all sorts of shapes and sizes. No matter what it changed into, it couldn't get free of those terrible teeth and the grinding jaws. Finally, the spirit shadow tossed it aside, and it hung off the net, a formless lump of shadow. Tal bit back a sob. His shadow guard had always been with him, always at his heels. It had saved him from troubles both large and small. Now it had been destroyed in a few seconds. He couldn't believe this was happening. Spirit shadows didn't damage shadow guards. They couldn't hurt the chosen. Unless, he thought suddenly, all the rules were different beyond the veil. "I shall eat both shadow and flesh," said the spirit shadow as it reared back and lifted its head high above Tal. Snow whirled behind it like a cloak of white. Tal could see inside its huge mouth, see all the rows of teeth. There were strips of cloth and other things stuck in the teeth, accompanied by an awful, rotting smell. In that moment, Tal realized that this thing had killed before. It was going to kill him, too. It did not matter that he was one of the chosen of the castle, a light bringer of the Orange Order, a potential shadow master. As the thing struck, Tal threw himself aside and out of the net. Falling, he hit a net on the next level below. For the briefest second, Tal thought he was safe. Then he bounced out in a shower of sunstones, out into the air, too far out to be caught in the nets below. Tal saw the tower spinning above him as he hurtled down, along with the snow clouds and the whirl of snow and the sunstones that fell with him. The wind picked everything up, boy and snow and sunstones, and blew them farther away and farther out, beyond any chance of being caught in the lower nets. When he hit the veil, everything went black. His mind, overloaded with fear, went black too. He had only an instant before he became unconscious, time enough to break through the veil and see the twinkling lights of the castle so far below, and time to think a single thought. Why did I ever try to steal a sunstone?